So recently we created quite a stir when we brought forward the timing for the first rate hike by the Reserve Bank from 2024 to 2023. We now expect that the first hike will be in the first quarter of 2023 of 15 basis points, and another one in the second quarter, and a final 25 in the fourth quarter of 2023. That'll lift the cash rate up to 0.75%, which is effectively where it was before the emergency rate cuts leading into COVID. The Reserve Bank, of course, has provided consistent guidelines that it doesn't expect to raise rates until 2024 at the earliest. But I really think that they'll have to review that guideline over the coming months. And bear in mind that it's actually not a pledge. That guideline was firstly introduced in February this year, when the Reserve Bank forecast was that the unemployment rate by June 2021 would be 6.5%. Well, of course, we've recently seen the May employment report that reported that the unemployment rate is now 5.1%. So a lot better than the Reserve Bank was thinking back in February. And therefore it's logical that if they'd known about that rate back in February, they wouldn't have been giving that guideline of 2024. So my view is that over the next few months, we'll see the Reserve Bank moderating that 2024 at the earliest guideline. With that in mind, we're expecting that the 3-year swap rate that when we produced the report was 0.45 has now lifted to 0.6, and we expect that by the end of 2022 it'll be 1.2%, and that by the end of 2023 it'll be up to 1.7%. And of course that'll have implications for fixed rates right across the community, including fixed mortgage rates. With the unemployment rate having reached 5.1% in the May employment report, we've revised down our forecast for the unemployment rate by the middle of next year to 4%. And that's really important because that's where we think the full employment is, and we think the Reserve Bank has a similar view. So reaching full employment in the middle of 2022 has also meant that we've revised up our forecast for inflation and for wages growth. So we think by the second half of 2022, those conditions that the Reserve Bank sees as being necessary for raising rates, that is full employment, inflation above the 2 to 3% band, and a marked increase in wages growth, will have been achieved. I'm aware that there have been some times when the Reserve Bank Governor has talked about wages growth needing to be above 3%, but my view is that 2.75% with full employment and with inflation sustainably above that 2% will be sufficient conditions for that first rate hike. Of course, in the near term, the most important issue for the Reserve Bank will be the board meeting on the 6th of July. And let me confirm our view that we do not think that the bank will pivot their yield curve targeting bond from the April bond to the November bond. And think about that for a moment, because that is effectively tightening as well. So back in October last year, the bank was buying a 3-year, 6-month bond, being the April 2024s, at 0.1%. And today, they're still buying those April 24s at 0.1%, but it's now a 2-year and 10-month bond. If they choose not to pivot that purchase to the November bond, which would have allowed them to once again buy 3-year and 2-month bonds at 0.1, effectively what they're doing is tightening policy. On the other hand, the attitude towards quantitative easing, I think, will still be very aggressive. Whilst I don't think that they'll be setting a specific target, I think they'll be opting for a flexible approach, announcing that they'll be buying $5 billion, which is the current pace of purchases, $5 billion per week. And I think that will run until December. And we'll start to see the tapering at the beginning of next year, with the QE policy being phased out by the middle of 2022. And then, of course, 6 months later, we'll start to see the RBA tightening. That's going to be very much in line with what we expect for the Federal Reserve. On Thursday we saw the results of the June Federal Reserve meeting, and two things were quite apparent. Firstly, that the FOMC is more concerned about the inflation outlook, and secondly, more optimistic about the outlook for employment. We've seen the guidelines suggesting that the pace of interest rate increases has been brought forward, and we also expect that we'll see an announcement in September that the Fed plans to begin tapering their bond purchases from January. So a Fed policy of tapering from January along the lines of what we're seeing with the RBA, and that tapering would end, that the purchase program would end around the middle of next year, around about the time we expect the RBA to be completing their purchase program. So very important changes, not only from the perspective of the RBA, but also from the perspective of the Fed, and very much indicating that we think these two central banks will be moving relatively closely in alignment over the course of the next few years as their economies are recovering quickly. Thank you.